Well, I wanted to put together this video. It's probably the final YouTube that I'm going to put together before your SAC. And as always, whether we're in the classroom, at school, or you're in this online learning space, prior to a SAC, I like to sit down, open up the SAC, and make sure that it's fair and equitable to everybody. I want to make sure that there's no tricks in there. Obviously, we need to make some questions that are a little bit more challenging than others to separate out that top % of students. However, I want to make sure that there's nothing in there where you're feeling like you haven't been taught it and you're not 100% certain on it. So I've got a series of things that I just want to open, quickly talk you through, and then we'll leave it at that. The first one here is about carbohydrates. So we know that carbohydrates are the body's preferred fuel source during exercise, but one of the things that we may not have specifically mentioned is carbohydrate loading. So that is where you stack 80% of the diet to being carbohydrates prior to an exercise activity event that's going to involve endurance performance. It's going to make sure that you're in the aerobic energy system, and it's going to make sure that there's enough fuel there for the duration of that event. So carbohydrate loading is having more carbohydrates than usual. Up to 80% of the diet becomes carbohydrates, and it makes sure that we have plenty of fuel ready for that activity. The next thing that I wanted to discuss quickly was this table here that comes out of your textbook as well. And it's really interesting because we've just completed the 1500 meter run at a very, very high intensity. And a lot of people are thinking that maybe the anaerobic systems were dominant because of the high intensity. However, I just wanted to show you that even at a maximal intensity, when the duration event goes longer than 75 seconds, while there might be 50% contribution from the PC and anaerobic systems, there will already be at 75 seconds a 50% contribution from the aerobic system. Now, maybe the aerobic system's not able to produce that as quickly, and therefore it's not as brilliant as the PC and the anaerobic systems for providing at a fast rate, but the yield, the amount in which it's going to be producing is good. And also the dominant fuel during that 75 seconds plus maximal run is carbohydrates. So that's important to know for your 1500 meter run as well. Which brings me to this little table here. This little table here goes all the way up to 2 minutes, 240 seconds here. Sorry, 4 minutes, 240 seconds. And at that exhaustive exercise of 4 minutes, while we're still getting 21% through the anaerobic system, because we're at exhaustive exercise and we're working above what the threshold of our body is able to work at, we're actually only producing just about 80% of the energy through the aerobic system. So that might mean that it is a dominant system during that 4 minutes of running, etc. However, we're still producing 21% through the anaerobic system. Important to note that you are getting energy through both means because, as we know, all three energy systems are always working, and that has to be in an answer about the interplay of energy systems. This came from one of the slides on Mr. Smith's class, and if you think about it, we've mentioned VO2 and the volume of oxygen that your body can bring in, transport around and utilize, but the VO2 max is something that maybe we haven't touched on very much, and that's essentially what is your body able to bring in, transport around and utilize in regards to oxygen when it is at its maximum capacity, the maximum amount of oxygen somebody can use during intense exercise. Genetics play a part, your age, because VO2 max decreases after the age of 25, and also your training status. So a trained athlete can have up to 20% better VO2 max than somebody who is untrained. So how can you work above your VO2 maximum? Well, we're working above the comfortable level of the body bringing oxygen in. That means we rely on anaerobic systems such as the anaerobic glycolysis system, and we're building up hydrogen ions and lactate, so lactic acid at that stage. Next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was about the anaerobic glycolysis system. In particular, I wanted to mention something that came from one of my very first videos, which was at the end of last term and during the holiday homework. And when I look at the amount of views that that video has had, not everybody in the class has seen it. And this could come up potentially on this SAC because it has been taught. And that is about ATPase or ATPase. These are enzymes, and those enzymes help with the processes of contracting muscles and going through the breakdown of ATP, releasing that bond, and also the breakdown of glycolysis, etc. And so one of the things to note is that hydrogen ions, which make the muscle pH fall because they are acidic, they inhibit or stop glycolysis. And one of the things that is happening here is that they stop this enzyme from being able to do its job. I might actually leave that. Oh, no. I'm going to leave those two and come back to them in a moment because I want to show you these two first. We've spoken about this. We've seen this table. This is about ventilation, tidal volume, and respiratory rate. These are three acute responses to the respiratory system, which is your breathing and the airways and bringing oxygen and air into your body and breathing out carbon dioxide and air. One thing to note here is that this is in breaths per minute. This is in litres, and when you multiply those two together, you end up with litres per minute. That's absolutely fine and makes a lot of sense and is quite an easy calculation that I trust all of you are able to do. One thing I want to draw your attention to here, actually two things on this page. Firstly, stroke volume is measured in mils. Heart rate is measured in beats per minute, and yet cardiac output, which is stroke volume multiplied by heart rate, is actually in litres per minute. So if I was to multiply 75 times 82, I do not get the answer of 6.2. One of the things that you need to do is convert mils to litres, and there are 1,000 mils in 1 litre. So you need to be able to complete that conversion if you were going to do this calculation in a table. One of the other things I want to show you here is that this shows an untrained athlete and a trained athlete. And what you can see is even at rest, an untrained athlete, which we would consider ourselves in this 1500 meter example, is at a lower amount of blood being ejected per the heart per beat in comparison to a trained individual. And that is because the heart becomes larger and stronger. So with every squeeze, there is more blood going to be in the heart for the trained individual, and it's going to be a stronger squeeze, so more blood can be ejected. And that equates out to having also the ability to produce a higher litres per minute at the maximum in comparison to what we can do as untrained athletes in litres per minute. And when we look at that extra 2 litres essentially, that is a lot of blood and a lot of oxygen being transported around the body in comparison of a trained individual compared to an untrained individual. And you'll notice here that because there's more blood being squeezed out per beat at rest, this athlete doesn't actually need to have their heart pump as fast to get the right amount of oxygen around to the body. So that's an interesting thing to note. So conversion of mils to litres, and also looking at the comparison of trained and untrained individuals in relation to their heart. I'm going to ask you now to join a class Zoom. And the whole idea of today's class Zoom is going to be around the interplay of energy systems. I've been reading responses, I've been emailing students back, and we are not ready to answer an interplay of energy systems question on the SAC that is coming up on Thursday. And we know that there's going to be a question about it, and it's going to be about the 1500 meter run. And I feel like everybody should be able to formulate a really good answer for a long-winded question around this. So that's going to be the focus of the Zoom. It won't last the entire lesson. It's going to be some practice questions that you can choose to complete with me. I won't put you into breakout groups. We'll complete them, and then I'll show you some answers, and then I'm going to give you some time to complete your study or stay on the Zoom and ask me some individual questions that you need. I'll see you in a minute.